welcome to Cinema Smackdown for Sunday, October 20th, 2019. My name is Michael Brody. I'm joined today by Shane Simmons. And we're counting down the hits. Which is kind of what we're doing today.
Flashback hits, yeah.
How you doing today, Shane?
Adequate. It is October, so it's cooling off.
I enjoy any answer that begins with, nah.
That's how most, anytime anyone asks me, well, how are you doing? I persist.
Well, persisting is okay as long as you linger. We all enjoy the lingering. Yeah, so we're in the Halloweeny season. We did a week of Halloween chat last week. What did we talk about? I don't even remember. Horrible horror films based on your movie nights.
Oh yes,
you had done theme months.
Yes, we covered a number of horror theme type things.
Yeah,
and because it's October, we just can't shut up about Halloween.
You know me.
Any excuse to talk about horror films.
Any excuse to talk about horror films. So Shane, this was your brainchild. How would you define our topic for this week?
Well, we're currently in a spate of horror films that seem very nostalgic for the 1980s, which is interesting that we've moved on because for a while there we were stuck in a glut of horror films that were nostalgic for the 70s.
True.
And I've always found that with cinema in general, there's always a nostalgia for a couple of decades earlier, which I think is a result of people growing up in an era like a decade, being a little too young to appreciate what was going on, and then getting old enough to enter the film or television industry, and having a nostalgic flashback for that era, so they sort of celebrate what was going on about 20 years earlier. So I noticed this in the 70s, it was like a 1950s nostalgia, 80s had a 60s nostalgia, 90s had a 70s nostalgia, and so on and so on. But horror seems to be stuck in this even earlier period of a little bit longer ago, the 70s and the 80s, and I think the reason for this largely is no cell phones. It's so much easier to isolate your horror film victims in an era when they can't call an Uber. So lately, of course, yeah, we've had stuff like It and Stranger Things that are just wallowing in the 1980s. Hey, let's refer to this horror film and this horror film and this horror film. And I thought, well, why don't we talk about horror films of the 1980s that aren't referenced quite so much?
Right.
Ones that we quite like, but that some of the very mainstream nostalgia porn of horror seems to skip.
Yeah, that works for me. I did pick a few way more obscure ones that people would never pick under any circumstances, but come from the era and have or of note or have validity or what have you.
Well, there's probably a few that we both have that most people in the audience would not have even heard of.
I went with a lot of those.
Yeah, good. Well, why don't you hit me with one?
Okay. I can start us off. There was a movie, I didn't write the dates down for these, so my go-to...
80s in general. As far as I'm concerned, the 80s period of that style of film really began in 78 with Halloween and ended around 1992 with Peter Jackson's Brain Dead.
Sure, that works for me. I picked a lot of different films, but I have a bunch of overlooked slasher films because those are sometimes entertaining or sometimes interesting. One of the earliest is an early 80s film. It's a Canadian movie called Happy Birthday to Me.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm very fond of. It's a whodunit where we see a group of friends who've all got some kind of secret that they're all sharing be knocked off one by one in fairly interesting and really, really nasty ways. Most of the ways people die in this movie wouldn't be in a modern horror movie. They're just kind of grotesque in that uncomfortable way, which is not how horror is done anymore. It's very slick now. Everything has to be an 80-foot tall lumberjack with a billion teeth. You'll never...
I don't know what film you could possibly be referring to.
But in a movie like Happy Birthday to Me, you might have a scene where a character is fixing a motorbike. So he's got his motorcycle upside down, held while he's running the motor and the tire is spinning, and the killer just walks up behind this guy and takes his scarf and feeds the man's scarf into the side of the chain, pulling his face towards the spinning wheel. And it is really brutal. It's a moment of like, oh no.
Yeah, slashers of that era really seem to have a weapons of opportunity motif to them.
That movie in particular. So I like the fact that Happy Birthday to Me is a Canadian film, and I like the gruesomeness of it. And it does feature a recurring slasher motif is when the movie ends with the final girl, and oh boy does this movie have a final girl, being led into a place where everyone in the movie who has been killed has been gathered up and assembled at a table for her delight, just so there can be a major confrontation moment. There's a few Friday the 13th movies that have that, and a few other. It's just a recurring motif of let's gather the corpses, everyone.
Yeah, I was going to say one of my favorite ones, which is an Italian film from that era called Stage Fright by Michele Soavi.
Michele
Soavi. Oh, okay, sorry.
Michele Soavi. I love to pronounce his name, so
okay, well, good. Well, you do it better than me, and I will stick to my Basil Polidorus's. So, reference. Yeah, he of course later went on to do the wonderful Cemetery Man. But back in the 80s, he did a slasher film called Stage Fright, which is actually one of my favorite slasher films, and also features one of those, I will now create a tableau of the bodies, not realizing that there's even a survivor girl left, which is interesting.
Oh, that's a good point. I haven't seen that movie in quite a while, but it does feature a delightful killer.
The guy in an owl mask.
Owl-masked killer, but I won't say it's one of my favorite slashers, although it has a lot of style. I mean,
there's a lot of really crap ones from that era, so this one...
it's better than those.
Oh, yes, much, much better than those. Because I would say this is also the tail end of the Canadian tax break era, so we were producing a lot of slasher films in those days, because they were profitable and cheap to make.
That's right. Yeah, if anything cheap, it's a bunch of young adults pretending to be teenagers at a campground or a school or something, that kind of thing. Anyway,
getting naked in a tent and then being chopped up.
I think Happy Birthday to Me is a good one in that it leads to a point, and the final confrontation stuff is so demented, but also satisfying at the same time, that I quite respect that movie and its madness. So, at any rate, that's my first shout-out to a film that there is no way there's going to be an homage to on, say, Stranger Things.
Yeah. They could conceivably do a My Bloody Valentine tribute. You never know.
Sure. Which, again, Canadian.
Yeah, Canadian, and probably one of the more memorable titles of that era as well.
But it hasn't been, just to do the trivia for that film, for My Bloody Valentine, it has not been available to see uncut until very recently.
Well, it's been... The uncut version's been around for a good 10 years now. Because that was one that...
On its 30th anniversary.
Exactly. It was one of those films that came out around a time that there had been some sensational murder that had happened, and they got cold feet about, we can't put this out with all this really gory, bloody killings, and so a heavily censored version came out, and they thought that the original gore effects had all been lost until they found a print in Japan.
Right.
And that got released for the anniversary edition.
Yeah, and that's kind of a fascinating thing, but the fact is that most of the people who have any fondness for that movie saw a cut version.
To the point where, the climax of the film, the editing makes no sense whatsoever in the theatrical version, because they had to cut out all the gore, and without the gore, you're left with a bunch of unconnected shots that just don't work.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it really is fascinating. The fact that we now live in the Netflix era where the goriest horror movie ever made might just be broadcast unannounced on a Thursday night.
Or maybe part of a TV show.
Yes, yeah. And then they have the audacity to say, well, we need the MPAA to help us make sure that nothing in a cinema with an 18-plus sticker on it ever gets seen by children. It's like, well, your children are watching the worst of the worst right now.
There's literally stuff in Breaking Bad that would have been censored in the theater back in the 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, almost any 5 minutes on the Walking Dead show.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know when it happened, but they decided at some point, you know what? We should just take this as slapstick comedy. It's gore, it's fun, it's for the kids. It's not serious, so we don't have to, get our panties in a bunch about it. So the MPA sort of backed off from that sort of thing.
Well, other than Stage Fright Chain...
We'll just stick to censoring sex.
Other than Stage Fright Chain, what's your what's an overlooked 80s film for you?
Well, while we're on the slasher films, I will just also throw in the other Canadian pick that we have to mention is Prom Night, which is one of those many legion of Jamie Lee Curtis slasher films.
She's in 3 major ones that pop to mind, and probably more than that.
Yeah, more than that, because you're probably also forgetting
Terror Train.
Terror Train, yes.
Well, I'm not forgetting that one.
Okay, because
when I say 3,
Halloween and 2.
I'm not counting sequels here.
Okay, fine.
Because, there's
Well, what
5
about... Oh, okay, well,
movies.
here, I got one for you. That kind of counts. Road Games. The Australian film.
Not for me.
No?
No, it's a thriller. That's not a... It's by no means...
There is a serial killer in it.
But what... You name something that doesn't have a serial killer in it.
Well, from that era, the Care Bears movie.
The serial killer on that film was the producer, who I have heard stories about. At any rate.
But Road Games highly recommended, regardless of whether you think it's a horror film or not.
Yeah, it is a great movie. But the 2 main characters are laughing through most of that film, having a grand old time. It doesn't feel like a horror movie to me.
It's a road film with a serial killer. Well, okay, road film with a serial killer. Recently rewatched it. Have to say, still love it. The Hitcher. Rutger Hauer. We actually watched this at movie night as part of a tribute to the late great Rutger Hauer. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't want to show Blade Runner because everyone's seen that 5,000 times. But he's fantastic in The Hitcher. It's a great moody piece. There's lots of wonderful little inventive bits that happen in it, and a few truly horrifying moments.
Oh yeah, it's again a movie that would never be made today. It's one of those films like I wouldn't even think would be made independently today, because an independent producer would say you can't put this in a film. It's just we're gonna get crucified if you put this in the movie. And
even the remake of it didn't have the balls to do what the original did.
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Well, it did something horrible.
Yeah,
it gender switches something
so
that it's not. Well, it happened to a guy, so that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They do go that route. I mean, it's a strange. The Hitcher remake doesn't work. It doesn't have the grittiness that makes the original work. It's just sort of any old thriller movie, and it's really it's real slick. So nothing in it has any gritty feel to it. We're talking about the remake. The original is all hard edges and reality and pain. So it's a great film. I actually had The Hitcher on my list, so there we go.
There we go, our first crossover.
But that's a pretty big film, at least as far as I'm concerned. A fun thing to do while watching The Hitcher is pick out the Rutger Hauer's accent slipping moments. And at that moment, I will say, we're just going to take a quick break and come back after these messages. Not bad. I said, not bad. Mm-hmm. I feel okay about where we're at, how it went. Sometimes we're in we hit an ad break and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, well, no, I was spending the last 5 minutes anticipating it coming up.
Anticipating?
The ad break.
Well, it's good to keep aware of when they are.
Yeah, just...
But actually, you were right at the end of a thought, so...
Is this thing on?
There's Allison again.
Allison, every Wednesday at 11 a.m. on Transistor
10 seconds. We're back.
No.
Yeah, it's real quick.
So then they can get stuck in yours. The best in alternative punk indie with a sprinkling of pop. Only on CJLO 6090 AM.
And we're back on CJLO 1690 AM. My name is Michael Brody. I'm joined by Shane Simmons. Our little show here is called Cinema Smackdown, and we're counting down the not hits. Sort of. I think the point being that we are talking about Halloween/horror movies that are not... it's a much bigger concept than can be summed up in a sentence.
Yeah, well, it's the 80s nostalgia horror films that no one's actually nostalgic about, which is a pity because the 80s were an embarrassment of riches when it came to horror films.
Right, that's the gist.
Horror tends to go on an off-again, decade-by-decade schedule. So 80s just happened to be a big glut of creature features. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've mostly only talked about the slasher films / serial killer films of the era, but there's also a heavy amount of latex and goop-driven horror films.
That's a good cue for me to mention two. I'll start with one. I'll mention two off the top, but I actually have a third one that will come in later. So speaking of heavy-duty special effects done to the extreme, certainly for the era, is 1985's Reanimator.
Oh, yes.
Which probably does have a fair amount of nostalgia. It just bears...
Yeah, and yet it's one of those films, and it did get a couple of sequels, which...
Sure, but that's not
but
the
it's
sequel issue.
no, exactly, but it's one of those films of that era that I'm a little bit surprised there hasn't been a remake.
Yeah, me
because
too.
they will remake damn near anything, and some of the stuff that's gotten a remake has actually surprised me. Why would you bother? And Reanimator was one of those, well, it's a lightning in a bottle film. You're never going to get that cast and that mood working as well as it does in that wonderful, dark, black comedy of gore like you have rarely seen in a film before.
Well, you'll never catch, again, I think you just said, this lightning in a bottle that was the Professor character.
Mm-hmm.
Because that guy is weirdly magnetic. So much so that he's the villain in the director's next movie, which is totally unrelated, which is another film I wanted to mention called From Beyond.
From Beyond, yes.
So we'll mention them both.
Also on my list.
Together. And again, they're gooey movies. They're both claiming to be based on H.P. Lovecraft stories, but they're so far removed from anything he actually wrote.
Well, Herbert West Reanimator is legitimately a H.P. Lovecraft story.
Yes, but it's like a 10-page story.
Well, most of his stuff is. He wasn't big on the long format.
There's just not a lot of content from that story in the film you're watching.
Right.
It's not about a guy trying to make it work with his roommate while reanimating corpses in the lab at the university.
Hey, want me to bring your cat back from the dead? Yeah.
Yeah, none of that stuff is from Lovecraft. That's Stuart Gordon.
Certainly, and Lovecraft never wrote a character who is as charismatic yet off-putting as Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West.
My favorite thing was about 20 years ago, there was a special edition DVD for that movie that came out, and there was a commentary track with the whole cast, and the first thing lead actress Barbara Crampton says on the commentary track, her first words out loud are, "Oh, Jeffrey, look how young you are." 20 plus years ago.
Well, also, look, Jeffrey, how alive you are. Because he was actually declared dead. This is a minor point of trivia. Declared dead on September 11th, 2001, because there was someone on a plane manifest named Jeffrey Combs.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But it was a different one.
Did not
And
know that.
yeah, he had to go around explaining to people, no, I'm still alive. I did not just crash into any buildings that day.
The formula works! The glowing green formula that
Herbert West could have come back from that, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. I am a huge fan of the original Reanimator, but I will say this, if you have never seen the movie, I actually don't think that the original theatrical cut works. The only version I think works is the one called The Extended Cut. It is not considered a director's cut. It is considered we added all the cut scenes back in version. There's no extra violence or gore. What there is more character and plot stuff, some of which entirely explains characters' actions, which in the original cut...
That is true, yes.
There are character moments where a guy just does something that makes no sense all of a sudden.
Yeah, there is one character in particular who we're supposed to know in the extended cut that this guy has been mesmerized, basically, and brainwashed into thinking something that is not true.
Exactly. And so when his character in the original theatrical cut is suddenly no longer willing to listen to reason on any level, it makes no sense.
It's like, yeah, you were a normal, nice guy 10 minutes ago. What happened?
Yeah.
It's like, well, this whole other scene happened.
Yeah, and it's very strange to me that very short segment of the movie is cut out. But anyway, I do believe that version of the film is the definitive version.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was probably one of those films. Well, it's a gory horror film. Let's market this as a drive-in type of movie, and those things cannot possibly be longer than 90 minutes, right?
Right. At any rate, Reanimator is one of the high points. It was also a movie that I spent a decade hunting down an uncut copy of because in the 80s, of course, it was trimmed to death.
Yeah, so hunting uncut versions of films in the 80s was quite the challenge.
It's probably why there's so much nostalgia for that era.
Yeah.
Big piece of it for me.
Well, I remember going out of my way, miles and miles out of my way, in fact, to find the one uncut videotape copy of Day of the Dead.
Right.
Because one of those films, I rented it and said, there's something off about the editing of this film. And then I realized, every single headshot that happens in this zombie film, this classic Romero, third part of his trilogy zombie film, has been cut to the point where by the climax of the film, it's just not making any sense anymore.
Yeah.
And I heard a rumor that one video store in the West Island somewhere actually had the uncut copy, which was not permitted in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to go out there, rent it, copy it, and then show it to everybody.
Right. Well, that is not an overlooked film by any means. Although
no,
compared to Dawn of the Dead, it's almost unknown, but it is a masterpiece. So
yeah, and aesthetically, it does more for the zombie genre than Dawn of the Dead ever did.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Dawn of the Dead is probably the reason why that genre even exists today.
All right, well that's enough about Stuart Gordon's little double feature of Lovecraft films from the 80s, both of which are worth visiting at some point. With what is it? From Beyond and Reanimator. So give me another one completely. Let's go somewhere else, Shane. What else you got for me?
Certainly for me, the cringiest moment of It Chapter 2 was the moment when a head grows legs and starts walking around, and Bill Hader is required to deliver the line, "Oh, you've got to be effing kidding me," which is mirroring precisely the scene from John Carpenter's The Thing. And,
I will cut you off right now and say, A, we have talked about that movie way too much on this show, and B, that is a movie that is directly referenced in Stranger Things more than once.
Exactly.
So
I
wouldn't call it an overlooked.
No, that's why that is my point exactly.
Okay.
That The Thing is not one of those. It's sort of an obvious go-to one. I would instead want to direct people to a more obscure and much more forgotten John Carpenter film, which is Prince of Darkness. Prince of Darkness.
Also gooey.
Gooey, and more full of surprise scare moments, which is usually for me a cheap thing to do in a horror film, but I've never seen it done so effectively in Prince of Darkness. To the point when I saw it in a theater back at the Atwater Theater when that was still a thing.
Ah, my beloved Atwater.
Yeah, and it had cinemas that were shaped like a bowling alley. They were very long and narrow. And where I was sitting in the theater for Prince of Darkness, you could actually see people jumping in their seats in waves. They were making the wave with every jump scare, including the final one of that film, where, and I've told this story many times, and I've probably told it on the show before myself, the girl behind me screamed so loudly for that final jump scare. I was already jumping out of my chair. I'm pretty sure I made a dent in the ceiling because she just screamed right in my ear. It was.
I don't think it has the same effect on, let's say, if someone's watching it on their phone.
No, God! Please do not watch this wonderful film on your phone.
I will fully agree that Prince of Darkness is. John Carpenter has about 6 amazing kind of. I just can't find fault in the movies, and that is pretty high up for me. It's if not the number one.
Yeah, for me that's right up there near the very, very top, and it is one of his least known films, I think.
Which is crazy. But, I mean, it's a challenging movie for a non-horror fan, or it has slow points if you don't know what you're in for.
Well,
it's a perfectly paced movie, but by modern standards, some people, oh, how come we're waiting here?
You know, the fact that he credits himself as Martin Quatermass, a variation on Bernard Quatermass of the Quatermass films, is a hint that it is that type of film where it is a mystery of, a bunch of experts are brought in to figure out what is going on. It's almost has that Michael Crichton formula to it, where diverse experts are brought in to examine a problem and figure out what's up with that.
I'm going to do a quick shout out. Now, I just wanted to fully stress how much of a masterpiece I think the movie Prince of Darkness is before I reference this.
Mm-hmm.
At the time of its release, our good friend Jean Guérin had the greatest imaginable slagging a movie review of this film.
Oh.
He said,
Jean didn't like something?
He said, it's the greatest, most intense build-up in a film ever to people spitting on each other. Which is completely accurate.
There's a fair amount of expectorating in it.
Yeah. But it is. Take that one as a piece of comedy because masterpiece.
Well, I also want to mention, because I brought up Quatermass, there is a Quatermass connection between Prince of Darkness and the much maligned and largely forgotten Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. That was apparently originally the script was worked on by what's his name?
By the Quatermass fellow.
Nigel Neal.
Yes,
yeah.
I read about this recently.
Yeah. So, and that certainly has that element of it's a mystery. It's a horror movie mystery of what the hell is going on here.
Well, I wanted to get to a film that I feel like I'm amazed doesn't get talked about more often in how ridiculous, entertaining, and effective this movie is, while still being utter exploitation trash, which is a 1985 Italian horror movie, which the English dub is widely available. It's called Demons.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it's by Lamberto Bava, but I'm not sure which Bava it is. I know it's not Mario. At any rate, it is a movie with the most wonderful premise. I have never seen this film projected theatrically, but I would love to see it in a cinema with a whole room full of unsuspecting people.
I can't remember if I saw it. I might have actually seen that in a cinema.
The reasoning is a bunch of people are given an invitation to come watch a new movie in a movie theater. And this diverse group, much like a Stephen King story of different groups of people who kind of meet in an area, show up at this movie theater and start watching a movie. And while it happens, one of them gets infected by essentially a demon disease that starts transforming into a monster. And then that character starts infecting other people. But the whole thing takes place in the cinema. So if you watch it in the cinema, watching people get attacked in a cinema, this movie has so many wonderful, strange, gross-out effects and great ideas. No one is safe. It's one of those movies where they will clearly point out who the heroic characters are and then almost immediately kill some of them off, so they let you know, just, keep your attention high. You never know who's going to make it through this. It's just a wonderful little trashy exploitation movie. I don't know if you're a fan or not.
Yeah, I remember quite liking it at the time, and then it sort of got lost in the mix of only semi-related sequels.
Right. There's a direct sequel called Demons 2, which is terrible. It's where a very similar thing happens in an apartment building, but
it was a series I quickly lost interest in because, the sequels are increasingly rubbish.
Well, it lacks the humor and bouncy intelligence of the first film. The fun is gone in the sequel. And then they made 3 or 4 more movies called Demons 3, 4, 5,
Yeah,
6,
I'm pretty
7.
sure it was one of those situations where they just started slapping on
Exactly.
numbers and saying, sure, this is a Demons film, why not?
Yeah, none of them, including one that's about birds. A vampire movie about killer birds. Yeah, it's a shame. I basically ignore everything beyond the first film, which is a very, very complete movie. And if you watch the movie, if this inspires you at all to go watch a great 80s film, the Demons movie, watch right to the end of the credits. Because there is a mini sequel at the end of that credit scene.
Yeah, I don't remember.
It's one of those films.
Mm-hmm.
It is. Shane, if you don't recall this movie,
do they plug the next Marvel film? Is that what they do?
Nick Fury does show
Oh,
up
yeah, okay.
and shoot the main character in the head. That's how most movies should end these days, I think. They should just have this...
Don't they all end that way these days?
It would be funny if...
I'm a little tired of them
an
ending that way.
alarming number of movies ended with Samuel L. Jackson with an eye patch recruiting everyone for every... That's how The Hangover should end, with Sam Jackson recruiting...
I'm tired, sick and tired of these mother effing Skrulls on this mother effing
spaceship.
Avengers spaceship. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so the Demons is a huge shout out for me. I'll remind the listener that you're listening to CJLO 1690 AM. Our little show is called Cinema Smackdown, and today we're talking about overlooked 80s movies, basically. And you'll have to sum the thing up again. What?
The
overlooked 80s horror.
80s nostalgia that no one's actually nostalgic about.
Exactly. The films that we think people
the
should
overlooked
be a lot
ones.
More nostalgic for.
Yeah, we certainly are.
Let's hear another one from you, Shane.
Well, no discussion of the 1980s would be complete without this particular film. Now, there are a bunch of vampire films that came out in that era. The one that gets the most nostalgia is probably The Lost Boys, which I really just have never cared that much for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. It doesn't thrill me.
Well, it's the Goonies. With a little more violence.
Yeah, and a little too many Corys in it.
And a lot of big hair.
yeah, indeed that. And then we were both fans of Fright Night,
Absolutely.
We both like Vampire. But the real one, the major player, you know it, I know it, we all know it. Or we all should know it at least, is Near Dark.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Vamp.
Well, that too, obviously.
Have you seen Vamp?
I have indeed seen Vamp.
Do you recall that in the movie...
I'm hard to stump when it comes to 1980s horror films.
Do you recall that in the movie Vamp, there's a character who becomes a vampire, realizes, I'm condemned to become a vampire, it's terrible, and urges his friend to stab him through the heart with a...
Oh, right, stake. Yes, I remember this.
Do you recall how this plays out?
Yes, and then he turns out he's miraculously still alive, and he goes, Formica, who knew?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's insane. That's a major plot.
Yeah, well, you can't stake vampires with pressboard. What can I say? Just doesn't work.
Apparently, it just doesn't.
Do not break up your IKEA furniture and go after vampires.
As we learned in the Monster Squad, kind of an overlooked 80s horror film. Kind of. I'm so hard pressed to call that a horror movie. In the Monster Squad, you cannot kill a werewolf with anything except a silver bullet. Which you don't recall?
Oh yeah, they blow up the Wolfman, and he just pulls back together and keeps going.
Yeah, that's very, very funny.
Yeah.
It's like, nope, we got to go with the magic curse aspect. It can't just be we murder him.
Yeah, no, that's and good on Fred Dekker and Shane Black for sticking to the rules.
It's very funny that you mentioned Near Dark, only in that movie is so clearly tailor-made to be beloved, and it's still pretty obscure.
It was so tailor-made to be beloved, they brought in half the cast of Aliens to star in it, which is one of those, it's like, everyone loved Aliens, so it's like, well, here's half the cast.
Yeah.
And it was still had that, it's, for my money, the best Catherine Bigelow film. I know we're going to debate Point Break, but...
prefer Point Break.
Yeah.
Grudgingly.
Yeah. I do think this is the superior film, though.
It's hard, the problem... Okay, here's why I don't love Near Dark as much. Because Near Dark stars an idiot. The main character in Near Dark, the guy who is the everyman who is brought into the situation, he's pretty hard to take. He's an unpleasant yokel character. He's dumb, and at no point in the film does he see anything positive about the concept of immortality. He's like, what? No, how terrible. There's not even a discussion.
I will say he is certainly the least memorable element of the whole film, even though he's the main character. Because it's really about these outlaw vampires, and they're never referred to as vampires. Famously, the film does not invoke the word vampire at all. But they're traveling around in their blacked out van, and one of their numbers turns this young hick and decides she's kind of into him and wants to bring him along. And they're like, I guess, are we really going to integrate this jerk into our little group? And then he does something that saves all their asses and becomes part of the group because of that. I
grudgingly accept him, but it's only in the sense of I find it very hard to sympathize with the protagonist in that movie, and that's a little rough.
Yeah, well, the group of vampires, for the most part, are really quite repulsive.
Yeah.
We have Lance Henriksen, who, as he says, he fought in a war. Oh, what war was that? Well, let's just say, what is it, the South lost, or whatever it was.
I fought for the South.
I fought for the South. We lost, that's the right, yeah. And we have Bill Paxton at his most Bill Paxton-y. I don't think Bill Paxton is this repulsive in any other film, with the possible exception of The Dark Backward.
And the other possible exception of when he's a big rubber puppet monster at the end of Weird Science.
Okay, that'll do too. With his great line, I hate it when they've been shaved. As he's drinking blood.
I forgot that line.
Opening people's throats with his spurs.
Ooh.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, I mean, we love to bring up our beloved Eric Red on this show. Eric Red, screenwriter of Near Dark and multiple murderer.
And also The Hitcher, right?
Yes.
That's him as well.
I mean, it's real hard to talk about the 80s without bringing up the genius work that Eric Red was doing. And you know what's astonishing is...
We have a lot of filmmakers that we're fans of who are guilty of vehicular homicide. We'll put it that way.
So, Eric
We're looking at you, Matthew Broderick.
I love his directorial. He must have directed something, but it's not coming to mind. At any rate, Eric Red, I love his work despite the fact that his films are full of way too much gunfire and way too many car chases. Almost every single thing he's ever done. He did make a Western in the early 90s, which I think is a little masterpiece in and of itself.
A lot of car chases in that Western.
And that's my point is they substitute car chases with horse chases. So, but there's plenty of gunfire. And I don't have the title for that offhand. It's not in my brain. I can't remember it right now.
Is there a scene with a couple of horses T-boning each other?
You know, I just said Dylan McDermott, but of course it isn't him. It's Dermot Mulroney.
Okay, well, they are. I think they can actually swap passports. They're that interchangeable.
I really enjoyed the Saturday Night Live sketch one of them did where they played a game called Dylan or Dermot. And they showed pictures of each of them and no one could tell them apart, and then he himself says the wrong name. It's one of the high points of all time of either of their careers. Yeah, so that movie is called The Last Outlaw. It's from '93. It was actually made for HBO movie, but it is brutal beyond belief and is an entire film of character actors having nothing but great one-liners and little baby character arcs. Like this movie features, I'm not kidding, in one movie, we've got Dermot Mulroney, Ted Levine, the killer from Silence of the Lambs, John C. McGinley, Steve Buscemi, and Keith David in the same film, all playing outlaw cowboys on the run and getting murdered and murdering people. It is a delight. Not a horror film, not on topic. I'll stop saying it.
No, but yeah. Related though, definitely Near Dark, which manages to be a Western, a vampire film, and a car chase movie. So
there you go.
There you go.
Exactly.
It's all the great elements of Eric Red combined.
I think it's just my point that I can't get over how much I love his work despite I hate car chases, especially extended ones, and
people guilty of vehicular manslaughter.
Once the gunfire gets past a certain point in a movie, I just tune out. With the exception, my all-time greatest exception of a movie where the guns almost never stop firing is called Way of the Gun. And boy, does that movie live up to the gun part of its title. I rewatched that last year and was astonished at how many times people pull triggers. Someone should count. Somebody should count the on-screen trigger pulls in that movie. It must break a record.
I don't know, more than a John Woo film?
I'm not joking. It's that many. I really under-described how much gunfire it was before I showed it to someone. There were a lot of head turns and staring.
And yet, for all the gunfire, the most satisfying moment of violence is Sarah Silverman getting punched in the face.
That is maybe in the history of cinema.
It kind of is.
Who's up? You were up. You just said...
No, I just hit you with Near Dark. You owe me one.
Well, let's do another Italian movie. I mentioned one earlier. I said Demons. Let's do another one. This one opens the slight can of worms of other things it's similar to or inspired by. I am a big fan of absolute piece of trash movie from the mid-'80s, Pieces. Italian chainsaw murder on a college campus movie.
Another film that faced being banned because it was a little too similar to murders that happened around its release time.
Well, my favorite thing about Pieces is the poster for it, which says, "You don't have to go to Texas for a chainsaw massacre," and then a second tagline under angrily written lettering Pieces. I mean, it's got an angry font. Under that it says, "It's exactly what you think." Which is so awful. It's an awful, awful thing to say.
It's exactly as bad as you think it's going to be.
When people say something is an exploitation film, they mean it's filled with gratuitous nudity, violence, and horror elements. And this movie is jam-packed with all of those. But because it's an exploitation movie made by, I want to say, people who have no idea what they're doing, there is also a full-on kung fu fight in the middle of the film. In case you don't remember that.
No, I don't remember. I have seen this, but
there is
I saw it so long ago, I saw it on videotape.
There's a Bruce Lee-like kung fu fight scene in the middle of the movie. where a Bruce Lee clone comes out and fights somebody. I mean, it is trash beyond belief, and has, I have to put it out there, I'll challenge you, one of the 10 most memorable endings of a film I have ever seen. Maybe in the top 3.
Yeah.
Do you not remember the ending of Pieces?
I do not.
I challenge you to at least watch the last 45 seconds of this movie. It is...
Is it up there with Twitch of the Death Nerve?
Oh, it's higher.
Oh, for endings.
Memorable.
Okay, all right.
On the level of memorable, on the level of... What
is it up there with Sleepaway Camp?
Yes.
Okay.
And higher.
All right.
Places higher for me.
Okay.
What? What? That could not possibly have happened on any planet. I also saw the movie Pieces when I was young enough that it was pretty upsetting. It's a pretty upsetting film. It's a trashy, dumb exploitation film with wonderfully bad dubbed dialogue.
Oh, well, speaking of trashy, dumb from that era, this isn't even on my list, but I had to mention. Do you remember Maniac?
Of course I do.
Yeah.
I actually like Maniac, whereas...
Wow.
I think Maniac is the good Joker movie. They're not that far off from each other.
I mean, aside from having some moments of Tom Savini gore effects, it is a colossally dumb film. And I watched it on the tail end of a New Year's Eve party. So our idea of having a good party was to get a bunch of people into a room at a friend's basement, and we would watch movie after movie after movie. We will watch that night 9 movies in a row. 9. I was the only one. I and our mutual acquaintance Mike were the only 2 people left alive at the end of that film, and we were everyone else was dead asleep. And we said, "This is the dumbest film ever if X, Y, and Z happens," and it did. And we woke up the entire room laughing our asses off.
But by the way, that's a good movie. All of the scenes in the film work and are truly disturbing, and that ending is perfect. The thing that you think is so funny and terrible is actually one of those scenes. It's like, well, that's actually kind of iconic, works perfectly. Let me explain to you. You were in a state of sleep deprivation. You would have laughed just as hard at the end of Schindler's List. Now look, Maniac is not, it's not a masterpiece, but it is a pretty good, dark portrayal of a person going crazy. By your logic, it would be a much better movie if Maniac ended with the main character getting into a car accident and being unconscious while other people took care of the ending of his film.
I don't know what you're referring to, sir.
By your logic, that's the way Maniac should have ended to truly be appreciated as a classic. Now, look, I'm not the only person who thinks it's a good film. A lot of people.
Apparently, Elijah Wood did because he wanted to remake it.
Yeah, well, I mean, he not only is he the lead in that movie, but he is a big fan and talks very lovingly about it. But I think it's important with Maniac to appreciate the Joe Spinell thing. You have to kind of, if you can't stand that person, the movie's unwatchable because it's just him being creepy for 2 hours. But that's him in every movie other than The Godfather.
I also figure that's him in every moment of his life.
All right, well, on that note, let's do a quick commercial break.
It is admittedly probably something that I would like better now, because
that's the thing. I think you'd be
in
fine with
in the era we watched it. It was still the 80s, so we're like, it's another shitty movie of this era, and now it's like
much better made than you remember. And again, it's dirty and awful.
Right.
But making that happen requires art.
Yeah, and the thing is, the dirty and awful genre doesn't exist the way it used to. So,
I mean, you got to remember, it's by the guy who wanted to make Maniac Cop and
Right.
Lustig, and he actually has an interesting tone to all his films. He's even made just some straight up thrillers. And when you watch him, you go, yeah, this is actually kind of engagingly gross and dirty. All right, we're back. And we're back on Cinema Smackdown on CGLS 1690 AM.
where we were talking about every single horror film made in the 1980s, apparently.
Yeah, that isn't famous. The less famous ones.
The less famous. Yeah.
Getting through.
Yes, we're mercifully skipping some of the franchise films that just got beaten absolutely to death.
And of course, as per usual, we have about 10 minutes left in our show, and I have 5 times as much content to talk about than we have time for. Give me another one of your picks, Shane.
Okay. Oh yes. Okay. Here's a good one. So of course, there's been a billion Stephen King adaptations. One of the ones that seems to have just been completely forgotten at this point, which I thought was the most effective, was Cujo. Even though Cujo became like this go-to, almost a catchphrase for, vicious anything. It's Cujo. But how many people at this point really remember that film or have seen it recently?
I've seen it so long ago that I have no recollection of it on any positive
Yeah,
level.
I mean, it is, maybe it's just because it's a dog film and I love me some doggies. But I definitely remember, as far as films about a lovable St. Bernard going rabid, by the end of that film, I was practically yelling at my television set, "Just kill him!" Which, a film has to go a long way for me to want to see the dog get killed.
Yeah, I hear you.
And, very effective piece of work. Skips a lot of the grimier, grungier Stephen King moments from the novel, which I think actually, in some ways, improves the story. Because, Stephen King, when his prose gets ugly, he doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
And this kind of just cuts down to the meat of what the story is and the horrible, horrible situation that needs to be survived in this film.
Absolutely. I have one for you. I feel like no talk of nostalgic 80s would ever be complete without at least referencing Waxwork.
Oh, yeah.
Which is such a dumb, fun movie. And it's like watching 8 movies. It is a film about a group of teenagers who visit a local waxwork museum where there are depictions of scenes from classic horror films, but don't step over the red. What do you call those things?
The rope.
Don't step past the red rope, or you will be sucked into the literal moment that is being depicted in the waxwork. Whether it be the hunchback about to kill somebody, a zombie scene, a vampire feasting on a maiden, you will find yourself in that world in that moment. And so the movie recreates dozens of wonderful horror scenes. And the crazy part, though, is a movie like this could have been made very classically, very cleanly. Not so in this case of Waxwork. It is an X-rated level of gore. The violence in this film is so extreme in places, I could hardly believe my eyes. It is so lovingly made by the director. It's his first film. He did a wonderful job on it. The character work is great. The level of entertainment value is really high, that I was willing to follow this director anywhere. He did make a sequel to Waxwork, which is fine. It's just more of the same, a little more toned down, a little bit more low budget. But he went on to make about 25 movies after this, and not one of them is worth a minute of your time. He went from Waxwork to being the hackiest hack low-budget director imaginable. And I didn't get it. I was like, I don't understand. You started off with all the storytelling skills anyone needs for a lifetime career, and then you just make crap. It's pretty astonishing to me. But it doesn't change the fact that Waxwork is a little gem. You do get to see a little bit of every kind of horror mixed together. And it stars Zach Galligan of Gremlins in a heroic lead. I don't quite get how for a period of time there, Zach Galligan was your go-to hero. I love that guy, though. He's a delightful everyman. I don't mean to slag him. He's great. He's made appearances
until Gremlins 2 destroyed his career, along with everyone else's.
Could very well be. I mean, if only it had worked its magic on Trump.
Well, Trump by way of Ted Turner in that film, yeah.
But it's definitely a piece of what's being shown to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. After Gremlins 2, there's not a whole lot of Phoebe Cates or Zach Galligan to be had. However, Christopher Lee seemed to do all right. His career kind of speeded up after that.
Yeah. But it did also destroy Leonard Maltin's movie. His acting career was just laid to waste by Gremlins 2.
Or if you've seen the straight-to-video version, the Hulk Hogan movie career was also ruined by this.
Right.
I don't know if you recall.
Yeah, no, I do indeed, and just think it could have been him and They Live instead of Roddy Piper. So.
I love the idea that Leonard Maltin would be the star of They Live. Why don't you hit me up with one, Shane?
Okay, so one from this era I absolutely love. There are a few. I would point to the 1980s as being this rare moment in history when there was not one, not two, but three truly excellent remakes of classic films.
That's true.
One being David Cronenberg's The Fly, the other being John Carpenter's The Thing, and the third one that everyone forgets is Chuck Russell's The Blob.
Yeah, written by Frank Darabont.
Exactly. Frank Darabont, who of course would go on to adapt a couple of Stephen King stories, including The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, and do the first season of The Walking Dead, and have various other high points of his career. Early on, he was one of the writers on the Blob remake, and the Blob, the original Blob, is not a film I particularly care about a bit at all. Even
Killer Jello.
Killer Jello, that is a symbolic representation of communism versus Steve McQueen. Sounds great, it's not so great. But in the remake, they take that premise and they run so hard and fast with it and do so many inventive bits and gore effects and wonderful, just inventive, fun action scenes with a giant, ever-growing blob from outer space eating people. It is fantastic. I highly recommend this film.
It is also another wonderful... Who do you think the protagonist of this movie is? Who's safe? Who's going to be the safe character who's going to make it all the way through this? That's always fun when the movie plays with your expectations.
It also has one of those pre-Saw series Shawnee Smith horror film appearances.
It's very strange that woman wound up being like almost the main character in the Saw films.
Kinda, yeah. The lead apprentice character.
She is such a Valley Girl type. It is hilarious. At any rate, I want to do a quick callback to an episode of this show we did a couple of years ago, you and I, Shane, in which we were asked by the former host to pitch the most gruesome ways you could die, and you said, I think the single most gruesome way you could die in a horror movie would be to be eaten by the blob, because you would be slowly dissolved while looking outside at the horrified faces of the people watching you die. To which the other guest on our show said, I don't know, con, you get eaten by the blob, but pro, you get to be part of the blob. Which I just thought was a wonderful, incredibly strange way of looking at things.
Well, again, going back to the original, that's a very pro-communist outlook on life.
Or, another way is it's like if you watch Star Trek: The Next Generation and you just root for the Borg.
Yeah. There's some people who just are into the collectives.
Yeah.
These are the people who go to conventions dressed as stormtroopers.
All right, I think I'm getting down to my final time to be able to talk about something from the 80s that would be great to be nostalgic about, but we're not. So, what else have we got here? I've got so many to pick from. I've got a pretty straightforward monster movie for you, but one of the better made ones, which is Pumpkinhead.
Oh, yeah. Also on my list. Yeah.
One of the very few Stan Winston directed movies, because he made a couple of terrible movies other than this, but he did make a wonderful film called Pumpkinhead. The funny thing about Pumpkinhead, to anyone who hasn't seen it, is I will recommend highly that you watch the film, and also that you kind of don't pay attention to the A story. Because the A story is about a bunch of motocross kids who are having the best time of their lives, driving around the hills and being absolute dicks. And it is pretty much impossible to root for the teenagers in this movie. They're just awful rich kids.
Meanwhile, Lance Henriksen summons one of the great monster designs of the 1980s.
Yeah.
Demon creature.
To reap revenge against them for doing something bad. So these rich kids do something bad with their motorcycles, and then the local hillbillies take revenge, Pumpkinhead style. And there is a creature in this movie which they bring forth who comes out to attack and kill. And, well, I mean, here's the thing about the movie Pumpkinhead. The people who made the movie don't want you to know this, but it's a real monster. They found it in the woods. They brought it in and shot it, because I've watched this movie several times, and there's no way that's a guy in a suit. That is just a real, living monster. There's no seams. There's no wires. It's just a real thing. I fully believe Pumpkinhead is real.
I don't know. I'm pretty sure he is a special effect, just like Lance Henriksen.
Yeah, I would find it much easier to believe Lance Henriksen was a Muppet than the creature. All I'm saying is that creature is so well realized. It is on screen exactly enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many movies either over or underuse creatures.
Yeah, that was one of the great hallmarks of the 1980s, where it was great creature designs that were physically present and felt like they were present, as opposed to the CG monstrosities that we get now, which they move around great, but they all look like Looney Tune cartoons.
Yeah, I'd argue with the they move around great part.
Well, they're very mobile. Put it that way. They're crawling up walls. They're running along ceilings. They can do whatever you want because they're cartoons.
It's been said many times. Part of the reason that the '80s stuff looks so good is because the directors were limited by what their puppets and creatures could actually do, necessitating writing around that idea and being as creative as humanly possible. Whereas now, they open the CGI box, there's no limits, nobody needs to come up with something clever, so they don't. Hence, 80-foot tall lumberjacks. Which, so horrifying, so well realized,
and
way to take me out of a movie.
And once again, who has the more effective spider head? It Chapter 2 or The Thing? Guess which one?
There's no comparison because one of them is memorable and one of them is not.
Yes.
But there is not a single effect in the It franchise.
Yeah, the only reason I remember that moment in It at all is because I sat there cringing.
Yeah, of course. It's an uncomfortable...
It's like, God, this reference, really?
Yes, of course. But in the original movie, there is a palpable reality to what you're seeing. There is something believable about that plastic head with pieces coming out of it. It just feels... you're trying to imagine, how was this made? How did somebody build this and push things through it?
Not to mention, this is just after someone's chest opened up and bit someone's arms off.
Yeah, it is quite an effective...
That whole scene is fantastic.
It's true that no discussion of 80s movies is ever complete without a constant repetition of, God damn it, the thing. The thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's about it for us for this week. We didn't nearly get through as many titles as I was hoping to, so who knows?
We only did about 200.
Well, we may end up chatting more about this in the near future. But at any rate, until then, I've been Michael Brody. I've been joined by Shane Simmons. This little show has been called Cinema Smackdown. And we will be back next week with another Halloween topic, regardless of what it may end up being. So tune in to find out.
Well, I'm actually quite pleased that we've covered that much ground. Cause,
honestly, I have 25 more.
No, I'm sure. Yeah. But
and many, I just didn't go into certain themes because I'm like, well, I can't open that box.
Right.
So, it could be another week's worth if you wish. I'll hang on to my list and we'll see how we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was good for jaunty chat. We did well on the jaunty chat aspect. By the way, I love your Maniac anecdote. You could have just said it. You could have just said it instead of saying X, Y, and Z. You could have just said it.
Yeah.
These mannequins come to life.
It is mannequins come to life. Yeah. I don't know.
It wouldn't bother me.
Even then, I was still like, I don't like to get into spoilers, but.
It is a very effective little movie. I mean, I don't recommend that you at this point in your life watch it because you've got more to do. But it's just fascinating to me that in this short period of time in which we are specifically talking about movies where people go crazy and do despicable acts, you're like, that one's a bad one, and I'm like,
Yeah,
no, it's not a bad one. Anyway,
like I said, we watched it in the era of, and it just felt like another throwaway one of those. Mm-hmm. Whereas opposed to now, it would actually seem like this gem of the past. They don't make them like that anymore.
I mean, it is getting on board watching 90 minutes of a despicable monster. Not even try to justify himself. Just go out in the streets and